I'm going to use a little model that I created to help us fill out this top portion on the daily tidal cycle. So for the daily tidal cycle, we're always going to have high tide and low tide. Um, Based on where the alignment of the moon is at. So the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's also 400 times closer to Earth. So it pulls twice as much on the tide. So we will always experience high tide whenever the Earth, right, is in line with the moon. So if you were at the beach and this represented you sitting at the beach, right now you'd be experiencing low tide. And if you think about it, it takes 24 hours for us to rotate one full rotation. So every quarter of a rotation, right, would be roughly 6 hours. So right now you're standing on the beach. So one quarter of a rotation, you're now going to be experiencing high tide 6 hours later. So then another 6 hours later, you're going to be back to experiencing low tide. And then another 6 hours later, you're going to be back to experiencing high tide. And another 6 hours back to low tide. So in one complete rotation, which takes 24 hours, you're going to experience two low tides and two high tides. Always the high tide will be where we're in line with the moon, and the low tide will be where we are not in line with the moon. So let's go ahead and fill out that top portion of our notes. So how many low tides occur each day? There's going to be two of them. And how many high tides occur? There's going to be two, right? And so, how often does a high tide and low tide occur? Well, as we said, 24 hours in a day, four tides per day give us a new tide every roughly 6 hours. And so, like I told you, the moon pulls twice as much on the sun because it is much closer to Earth. This means that high tide will always face towards the moon. Okay, so then now we have this also monthly tidal cycle that's going to be based on these different moon phases and alignments between the Earth, the moon, and the sun. So we're going to look at this little diagram here to help us fill out this section here. So the first one we call a spring tide. And a spring tide is always going to be when we experience this straight alignment between the sun, the moon, and the Earth. You could literally draw a line straight through them. So we're going to experience spring tides twice throughout the monthly lunar cycle, when it's a full moon and when it's a new moon, because you can draw a line straight through the sun, the moon, or the earth. The sun, the earth, or the moon. Okay, so during this time, we're always, like I said, going to experience high time when we're in line with the moon, but now the moon and the sun are going to be pulling together. So where high tide is going to be a much higher high tide than you would expect. And then the low tide, the tides are being stretched very thin there, so they're going to be a lot lower than you expect. So when you are experiencing low tide, you're going to experience a very super low tide. When you're experiencing high tide during spring tide, it's going to be a super high tide. So you're going to have two super low tides throughout that day and two super high tides. Why? Because the new moon and the full moon are pulling in line with the sun. So it forms a straight alignment, 180 degrees, and it gives us super high and super low tides. That's what we call a spring tide. So we can go ahead and fill out that top section. So the spring tides occur during new and full moons when the Earth forms a straight alignment. And you can kind of use that spring tide straight alignment, super high and super low. So these result in super high and super low tides because the sun and moon are pulling on the tides in the same direction, adding their forces together. So how many spring tides are we going to get each month? Well, as we saw, we're going to see the new moon and the full moon once each month. So we're going to see spring tides twice. Okay, so now let's look at the neap tides. So the neap tides are going to form when we have this 90-degree alignment between the sun, the earth, and the moon. The sun, the earth, and the moon, right? It forms a right angle or a 90-degree alignment. So what's happening here, as you'll notice, is that high tide is still always facing when we are in line with the moon, and low tide is when we are not. So now low tide is actually going to be pulled on by the sun, right? So your low tide is actually going to be higher than it was here in the super tides, right? The spring tides. It's going to actually be higher than we would expect normally. And then the high tide is going to be lower. So what we call these are very average tides. They don't change very much, right? They kind of stay in the middle. They don't get too high and they don't get too low. So you're not going to see much tidal range here between high and low tide. So if you were at the beach here experiencing high tide, right? 6 hours later, you're going to experience low tide. 6 hours later, high tide. 6 hours later, low tide, and then back again to high tide. But you would not see much tidal range between your high tide and your low tide because the moon pulling twice as much as the sun, right, is going to give you your slightly higher high tide, but the sun then pulling on the low tides is going to stretch them out almost evenly there. So you're going to get this, what we call a very average tides. A way to remember this is neap tides form a 90-degree angle and they give us average tides or normal tides. I like average just because it reminds me that they stay in the middle. So let's go ahead and fill out our notes here. So neap tides occur during first and third quarter moons when the earth, moon, and sun are aligned at 90-degree right angles. So neap 90 is going to give us normal, or I like to remember as average tides. So you can kind of use the N and the A in neap to remind you of 90 degrees and average tides. And these are tides that don't fluctuate very much. High tide is lower and low tide is higher because the sun and moon are pulling the tides in opposite directions. And just like with spring tides, we're going to see the neap tides twice whenever we have the first quarter and the third quarter moons. So then down here at the bottom, we can go ahead and fill out these diagrams here. We know in this first situation, this is the moon phase that's in between the earth and the sun. So this is going to be the new moon. We can go ahead and shade that one in and label this the new moon. And the type of tide this is going to give us, because it forms this straight alignment between the earth, the moon, and the sun, is going to be a spring tide. And the moon phase, like I labeled down there, is going to be the new moon. So then this phase here, we know that the new moon would be between the earth and the sun. So going counterclockwise, this would be our first quarter moon. So we can go ahead and shade in the left-hand side. This is going to be the first quarter. Just going to abbreviate there. And then the type of tide that you're going to see, because this forms a 90-degree alignment between the sun, the earth, and the moon, this is going to give us a neap tide or an average tide. So this moon phase down here, we have the new moon would be here, right? So this would be the waxing phase. This would be the waning phase where the light's on the left. So this would be our third quarter. We'll go ahead and shade in the right-hand side, label this one the third quarter, and the type of tide we would get, because it has this 90-degree alignment between the moon, the earth, and the sun, would give us neap tides, right? Or average tides. And so then our last one here, we don't need a shade in at all because we know that the moon phase on the opposite side of the earth is the full moon, right? So this is the full moon. And the type of tide this is going to give us, because it forms a straight line or a straight alignment between the moon, the earth, and the sun, we know that that is a spring tide, which is going to give us super high and super low tides. All right, perfect. So if you will flip that over onto the back, I have kind of drawn this little way to brain dump and model the tides here on the back already for you. We will then practice without this little guide tomorrow, but we can go ahead and start by looking. See, we'll have the sun on the left, we'll have the earth in the middle. So we know that this phase here is going to be the new moon. So we could go ahead and shade that one in and label it the new moon. We know that this one on the opposite side is going to be the full moon. So we can go ahead and label that one full. And then we know we're going to be going counterclockwise here. So starting at the new moon, going around, circling around to the left. So that makes this our first quarter. So we can go ahead and divide our quarter moons like we normally would. And we'll go ahead and shade the left-hand side of this one. Label this one the first quarter. We'll then go ahead and shade the right-hand side of this one and label this one the third quarter. So we have two types of tides that we're going to focus on here. The ones that we have that form a straight alignment between the moon, the earth, and the sun. We're going to call these spring tides. And these are going to give us super high and super low tides because they form a straight line between the earth, the moon, and sun. They're pulling together. So they give us that super high and super low, and we call them spring tides. So The other type of tides that we get are neap tides, and we had just talked about, they form a 90-degree alignment. So if you drew a line between the sun, the earth, and either of these quarter moon phases, you would get a 90-degree alignment. So we'll go ahead and notate that here. These are neap tides. And neap tides are what we consider average tides, and they form a 90-degree alignment. And I forgot to add this one up here, but they equal a straight line. So there you have it. You have neap tides that are average tides that form a 90-degree alignment. You have spring tides that are super high and super low that form a straight line between the sun, the earth, and the moon.